I've been dying to get this off my chest for years to people who don't think I'm crazy, as it's rather maddening. This seems like a place with understanding people. Before I start, I don't believe in things like Bigfoot, werewolves, ghosts, supernatural and paranormal stuff, but it doesn't mean I'm able to explain what happened this night. This was a long time ago. I was a teenager. My parents were not so strict, so I had a lot of freedom. I had 2 friends, and they had their own friends as well, and one of my friend's parents owned a huge part of this forest. So we, my friends and their friends, went deep into the woods with a bunch of supplies and started making our own treehouse and forts. This was a big part of my childhood, building things with my friends. And this place became our sanctuary. For a long time, we'd spend a lot of our time away from adults. This even happened years after we built the place initially, and also after we rebuilt it because it got destroyed one time. But that's another interesting story for a different time. This is a backstory for the events I'm about to recall. Me and my one friend spent the night at our sanctuary we built, which none of us have ever done before. We only hung out there, then went home. We all planned to spend the night together because it would be fun. Most of our friends weren't allowed to spend the night there because of their parents, and those who were allowed chickened out because they were afraid. So it was just me, one other person, my close friend's cousin, which we weren't close at the time, and we fought a lot. But surprisingly, we got along well that night. We spent most of the day swinging from trees, climbing them, and hanging out on this tire rope swing while talking. It was a normal day. Then we laid down for some rest around 9 p.m. About 10 minutes after laying down in bed, in our sleeping bags, talking to each other, under our makeshift tents, we heard rustling. I sat up and saw a very tall silhouette of something that looked to be humanish, but it was transparent. I could see right through it. I squinted and froze. It very quickly climbed up this tall tree when I looked at it disappearing. I was in complete disbelief and shock. I had no idea if I saw what I just saw, or if I had hallucinated it. I wasn't scared in this moment, actually perplexed. Being young and worried though, I said to my friend we should leave, and not wanting to hear me, I got close to his ear and just said, "There's something in the woods looking at us." After I said that, I saw his facial expression turn into fear. So we got up and started walking down the path out of the woods calmly. I didn't want to sprint because it might chase, and also I wasn't even sure I saw anything. I'm just not taking a chance. We both, very shortly after we started leaving, got this weird feeling of deja vu and confusion, like we were hit with hard drugs or something, except we don't do drugs and only ate food from our house. There's no hallucinogenic plants in our part of the country. Nothing. Everything was so slow and I felt disoriented, but we continued to walk in the direction for quite a while, stumbling in the darkness because of our mental state, and I realized we should have been out of the forest by now. I knew this was the way out, 110%. It was because I've been going in and out of this place for years, even in the dark. Yet I didn't recognize all the trees around us, just the path. It was like our surroundings were changing. My friend randomly yelled, "Yeah, I'm coming!" as I'm looking in the opposite direction from him, and I turned around and very confused asked him, why is he saying that? He told me his mum was calling his name to help lead him out of the forest. I heard nothing at all. I tell him I don't hear anything, and he looks at me like I'm insane. And as he walks off the path and into the forest, I grab his arm and pull him back because I don't want him to get lost. That's when my friend sees the transparent thing I saw earlier, sitting perched on a tree branch in the direction of his mum, where she was calling him from. And he points it out to me. Its transparency is almost like a heat wave effect. We stared at it for like 10 seconds in disbelief. It looked like a transparent being, but we were trying to discern if it was something else, and we were just imagining it being alive because there was no movement. But then it hunched down like it's trying to stalk or be stealthy, and it quickly climbed up the tree a little more and goes to the next one, then the next one, getting closer to us. We don't hear it at all. It's completely silent. Its silence is exemplified by the fact that all other creatures have gone completely quiet, which I had only begun to realize in that moment. Not a single bug or animal has made a sound since we started leaving. This is when our curiosity of it were both tripping and we were mistaking something turned to fear once we began to see it move. Once it got above us though, the only thing we heard was the crunching of branches as its weight was put on it. Every little sound that is made is so distinct because it is so quiet and remote. We can't see it because the top of the trees are so dark. We start actually running, terrified, not walking anymore. We hear noises in the tree above us until it fades away ahead of us, as if it ran ahead, but the sound was a lot quieter than if a normal animal was running tree to tree. As if this thing was light, but it wasn't exactly small, so that made no sense. We still kept running forward despite it sounding like it went ahead, and we end up back at the place we started. Many, many minutes of walking, and we're back at this place after running for like 20 seconds. It's impossible. But instead of staying on the ground, we climbed to the top of the treehouse with our items as quickly as possible and closed the door, wedging a small piece of plywood on it to keep it shut. We hear something climbing up and extremely odd noises as well, like mimicking noises of rain and wind. But there's no water seeping into our treehouse with cracks in it, and it wasn't wet when we left for a minute, and we didn't hear from it again. I'm pretty sure at that point it had left, but we spent the rest of the night there until the sun came up anyway. When we checked the time, right after we closed the door, it was 5 a.m. We started laying on the ground around 9 p.m. 8 hours had passed in less than 40 minutes of time. Hours after, we could start to see the sun through the treehouse. Then we went home. I no longer talked to this friend, but after this incident, we discussed it and said everything from both our point of views. We randomly brought it up to each other every few months and relived it, making sure we're still on the same page about what happened and what we remember. I've never spent the night out there again, and I didn't even let myself stay out there past 5 p.m. for a very long time. This is my story, and I'd be willing to take a polygraph test if the opportunity ever arises. And like most weekends, I was with my friends in the woods partying. We were all living in southwestern Ontario, roughly outside of the city of Kitchener-Waterloo, where the furthest outer suburb meets the edge of the countryside. This area of Ontario is interesting because it's a transition zone located on the limestone country around the Niagara Escarpment, presumably near some caves, as many sightings have been, and features areas of mixed broadleaf and coniferous forest, farmland, remnants or prairie and savanna, and cool, dark, boggy eastern cedar woodland, some of which is extremely old growth. The landscape, for Americans unfamiliar, is similar to the landscape in the eastern portion of the upper Midwest. I hear Wisconsin in particular is basically the same. I won't go into detail or answer any more questions about specific locations, as this is where I spent my teens, and I have friends and family still living within a kilometre or two of where this story takes place, so please respect that. The last thing I want is for the backdrop of this story in particular to blow up some kind of hotspot, unlike the area down east in my last story, which was a random transient spot on a county road. We had one of our usual bush parties in the Oak Savannah in a nature park, about 5 kilometres along the trails from my best friend's parents' place, and 15 or so of us were walking back, sometime well after midnight. The weather was warm and muggy, and so my best guess puts it at somewhere between July and September. There was probably 15 of us, and we were walking single file along the boardwalk that crossed through the cedar swamp on the edge of the park. Most of the gang, my best friend included, was quite drunk and stoned, and we were having a rowdy, raucous good time. I was actually reasonably sober, hadn't had anything to smoke, both of which were very unusual at the time, and was bringing up the rear since I had a flashlight and was a little concerned about one of the drunks tripping and falling, as it was an exceptionally dark night, as cloudy summer nights can be in the southern Ontario under the thick forest cover. I'm making this part clear because I want it to be evident that I wasn't really impaired, and that even though I'd had a few drinks, I still had the clarity to be concerned with us getting back without incident, and felt in control enough to follow the group by myself with the lights. As I mentioned, the atmosphere was pretty jovial and crude, as is typical for 15, 20-year-old guys liquored on a summer night. And while there were preceding times where the forest felt weird and foreboding, despite all being experienced outdoorsmen in much more remote areas and spending most of our weekends in the woods, this was not one of those times. Being as I was hung back from the group a little bit, I wasn't entirely locked into the gang's conversation and distracted and kind of doing my own thing. I was sweeping the flashlight around somewhat to my left and right as I enjoyed the nighttime scenery. I swept the flashlight to the right and noticed something kind of strange. I thought I spotted a deer darting away from the light of my flashlight off into the thicker, drier area of the trees beyond the cedar swamp, maybe 30 to 50 feet away from the boardwalk. As I watched it amble on sort of a semi-parallel diagonal alongside us and out of view, I started to feel sick. Something about the way it moved and the way it was shaped didn't make sense for a deer or any other animal I knew. We don't have much in the way of wildlife in southwest Ontario anyway, because of how much human land use there is, and outside of small irrelevant animals like foxes, raccoons, etc., there are really only deer and coyotes. I would consider that bears and wolves are possible in theory, but highly, highly unlikely, as far as I've ever heard. The animal, a skinny humanoid, was the same shade of white as the thing I've seen before. It had that same luminescent greyish white as the reflective strips on a pair of jogging pants, though duller. I saw no face in this instance either, though the head was equally bald and round or even oblong, like a primate's. Again, it appeared to be bipedal, though bent over on all fours, butt up in the air. Unlike the galloping creature that I saw in Nova Scotia, this one seemed to be moving more slowly, at a pace akin to a jog. It seemed to be trotting, almost like the gait of a happy dog, and I remember noticing tons of hip sway as it walked, almost in the squat sort of way a marmot, skunk or badger would move. This makes sense for the way a bipedal animal would move on all fours anyway, since hinging at the hips means that the ball and socket joint of the hip can't rotate fully, and the hip flexor muscles, being shortened, aren't able to be used with the same fluency for lateral forward movement. The thing made zero sound despite running off into the woods right in front of me, which was bizarre, considering the number of sticks littering the floor of the forest. I immediately felt my voice catch in my throat as immense primal fear gripped me. I realised nobody had seen it, all corked out of their heads and bantering about whatever topic. But also at the same moment, it occurred to me that if I raised the alarm, the whole group would panic and scatter, and ensuing chaos meant somebody would be, at the very least, likely to fall into the swamp or potentially attract whatever I just saw to our group. Was it stalking us? Was it startled and retreating out of fear? Or had it been discovered and was escaping the way a cougar does when you see its face straight on? I had no idea, and still am not sure. My heart was beating through my chest, but I continued to bring up the rear, constantly swinging my flashlight around and checking over my shoulder, as the hair, just like in the Nova Scotia experience, stood straight up on my neck and arms. We reached the road without further incident, but I was deeply, deeply disturbed. Now, several of us have had much more subtle, odd experiences in the forest before this, including hearing strange noises, unfortunately, similar to that typical crawler call. You know, the wood knocking and the feeling as if they were being watched or hunted. And once I personally had felt the intense and overwhelming intuition that I had to leave immediately. Nobody else in the group had felt as such, but I convinced them to go. My best friend, who unlike Buddy from the East Coast story, is extremely interested in the paranormal, he was equally as terrified as I was when I told him about this the next day. We still walk around those woods when I visit home. We've been quite cautious though. We're always inclined to expect something weird to occur when we head there at night. In February 2021, I was living and working on a homestead on the South Shore outside of Lunenburg. I planned a last-minute road trip up to the Bay of Fundy one Saturday morning as the snow was starting to melt and the weather was mild, and my buddy decided to come along. The bay is due north along a rural county highway, 100 kilometres from where we lived. The province has a similar geology to Maine and other coastal parts of New England, and even though most of the mountains are really just big hills and rolling uplands, geologically it's part of the Appalachia. The highway in question slowly rises in elevation from lower, sandier, rockier South Shore toward a high ridge called South Mountain, then plunges into the Annapolis Valley, then rises sharply again over a parallel ridge, which then drops into the bay. It was a mild, overcast day, about 5 degrees Celsius or 41 Fahrenheit when we left. While the clouds were threatening on the drive up and during our outing, the weather held until we started to head back. About 7 p.m, we get in the car to leave the bay. It starts to rain very hard. As we crest North Mountain, the rain turns to sleet, and by the time we're over the ridge, the temperature has dropped and it's snowing quite hard. We cross the valley and begin to climb South Mountain, and the snow is absolutely torrential, like walnut-sized East Coast snowflakes. At this point, I'm beginning to worry. I was raised in the snow belt in Ontario, so I'm used to very heavy snow. But this is bad, even compared to what I'm used to. On a number of occasions, that winter, I had seen 1 to 2 feet of snowfall between the time I went to sleep and the time I woke up before dawn. At this point, it's quite dark. I'm driving a 4x4 SUV with winter tyres, but despite the truck and my experience, I'm limping along at 10 feet of visibility in front of me at best. I'm concentrating hard just to stay on the road without the whiteout in front of me looking like hyperspace from Star Wars, and the wet, slushy snow rapidly covering the lines of the already sketchy rural 2-lane. I remember going 40 to 50 kilometres an hour in an 80 zone, which is 25 to 35 miles per hour in a 50 zone, and feeling like that was the best I could do. We were well on our way home at that point and came to a place where the empty highway dipped into a wetland area. It was a musky bog-type environment full of half-frozen mire and small black spruces and birches. The highway ran over a small sort of bridge or retaining wall, protecting a culvert that led the wetland pass under the road. Just as we crossed it, on the very edge of my visibility, so I'd say about 10 feet ahead, something ran from my left side across the road and to the right. It was humanoid in shape, quite emaciated, bright, sickly white even against the snow. It appeared to be between my height and my brother's. I'm 6'3" and he's 5'8". It had a loping biped on all fours gait, like a human bent over, arse in the air, and head sloped down, much longer legs kicking back and up as it bounded forward, and tons of shoulder and scapular movement with the front limbs, almost the way a wolf runs. It was a true gallop in the equestrian sense of the term, alternating front and back legs. I was struck by how fast it moved. It seemed agitated and excited, maybe even scared or angry. Remember, we were travelling 45 kilometres an hour, and this frenzied animal, or whatever it was, passed across the road as fast or faster than we were travelling. I didn't catch a face, and I'm glad for that, but just the glowing colour and smooth texture of its skin made me feel weird. It was such a thorough white, it almost reminded me of the whitish grey strips of reflective material on jogging gear. Though not as luminescent, it was duller, but brighter than any fur or feathers I'd ever seen. I was genuinely terrified in the moment. I've spent many years in the outdoors and in rural areas and feel very comfortable being in the sticks at night, but something about what we just saw seemed wrong on a fundamental level. The same way the sound of cutlery scraping on a plate or nails on a chalkboard touches something basic and primal in your brain that signifies bad. I knew somehow that it was a bad thing. Not dangerous in the way a bear encounter makes you feel, but very off. I instinctively locked the doors and began to speed up, and 5 or 10 good seconds passed before I managed to speak. "Did you see that?" And barely finished my sentence before my buddy countered with, "What did you see?" So I knew he saw it too. He's the opposite of the type of person that would ever claim interest or belief in any paranormal or cryptids, and doesn't have any interest in spooky shit. He even looks down on stuff like astrology and tarot cards, never mind creatures in the forest. While I'm not a huge junkie for this kind of stuff, I am cautiously open to it. He most certainly is not, and before this happened, he would actively degenerate people who claim to have seen anything unusual. A dark, eerie vibe settled into the car then. Things felt very oppressive and threatening. Other than the moderate stress of the snowy road, only a few minutes prior, we'd been enjoying our evening and chatting away as we usually did. All the hair on my body was standing straight up, and we sat in silence most of the way home, seemingly under the same dark cloud. As we get closer to Lunenburg and lower in elevation, the snow became sleet and then rain again, and the tense mood began to lift. We stopped on the way to pick something to eat, but still don't have much to say to each other, and ate mostly in our own worlds. We headed home and got to bed, but both of us barely slept that night. Now, we were living on the same plot of land as a medicine woman who was very well versed in a lot of her culture's folklore, and out of curiosity, we went and knocked on her door after breakfast the following day and asked casually if she was familiar with anything like what we had seen. She was actually visibly bothered that we asked, and she didn't want to talk about that at all. Said it was not good, and we never got a real answer out of her. I'm not sure if she was personally creeped out, or maybe there's some kind of folklore evidence among the First Nations of the East Coast. I spent months afterwards considering what it could be. My first thought was a canine or a bear that was piebald, albino, mangy, or some combination of the above. But the thorough baldness, the speed, the sheer size, and the gait and morphology, also their proportions, just do not fit the bill at all. You cannot hide the way a bipedal animal with longer legs than arms moves on all four legs, the way it kicks back with its glutes, and the rounded spine of its low back, the way its shoulders control its forelimbs, the low head posture. None of it adds up to a straight-backed herbivore or the head-forward posture of a predator. None of it. Nova Scotia is known for unexplained occurrences, but this was my first experience.